Good morning. We're continuing in our devotional series on Be Thou an Example. Currently, we're looking at Romans 12, verses 1 and 2. And in these verses, we're seeing perhaps one of the keys to really being successful in setting the example for others. And that is having a proper attitude about serving the Lord and setting the example for others. If you notice in Romans 12, in verse number 1, we've been looking at this in detail, looking at the different attitudes we can find in this verse that apply to a Christian. We'll look at one more today. It says, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God. All of those we've looked at in previous devotionals. Which is your reasonable service. That's where I would like us to stop in this verse. All right. Here we are told that we are to recognize the fact living our lives for Christ, in other words, seeking to follow His example that He has set for us first and foremost, is simply an act of reasonable service. Now let me explain that. Some people might think, man, if I dedicate my life to simply following the life of Christ, I lose my own identity. I take on the identity of someone else then, in the sense, I can't do what I want to do, I have to do what this other person did. I can't make my own choices, I just become a robot simply choosing the same way that Christ chose things. That's no life for me, some might say. Well, again, if you go back through several of our other devotionals from Romans 12:1, you'll see how, first of all, that's the improper way to look at things, and secondly, you can see why really that's a fallacy when people say that. But what I want us to notice here is at the end of this verse for today's time, which is your reasonable service. Folks, even if all that stuff was true, even if we did lose our identity, even if we did simply become what would be a seeming robot, simply doing what Christ did without thinking for ourselves, even if we did, you know what? That's not asking too much of us, and here's why. Stop and think about it. Christ gave His life for us on the cross. We should be willing to give up our life for Him totally and entirely. When Christ died on the cross, in the sense of Him and His physical life, was He able to make any more choices? Well, no, of course not. He was dead. I'm talking from His physical life, not as God, but I'm saying as Jesus Christ when He died on the cross, that physical body that was put in the grave. No, He didn't make any more choices. Yet people complain, if I follow the example of Christ, I don't make any choices anymore. He's always making the choices for me. When Christ physically died on the cross and gave His life and His body was put in the tomb, was that body recognized anymore? Well, of course not. It's buried in a tomb. So, the idea, we lose all recognition of our own selves. We just become another clone and we're not even our own selves anymore. I mean, folks, stop and think about what that's saying. When Christ died for us, when He gave His all for us on the cross, we owe Him everything. We owe Him our identity. We owe Him our choices. We owe Him our allegiance. We owe Him our submission. We owe Him to follow the example He has given to us. We owe Him because it's only reasonable. He gave His entire life for us. Folks, stop and think what would happen if, let's say, you're trapped in a burning house and whether it's a fireman or whoever, would run into the house and save you, but he would die in the process. Look, if it hadn't been for him, your life would have came to an end during that house fire. Any life you live after that, from the point in time you come out of that house alive, any life you live after that, you, in that sense, owe to the person who rescued you. Would it be unreasonable for that person to ask you to do something with your life? Well, not really, because you wouldn't have a life if it hadn't been for them. Now, I know that's a poor human example, but the principle, I think, does apply. If we understand what Christ did for us on the cross, we understand very clearly that whatever he may ask us to do, it's really reasonable when you think about all he did for us. He delivered us from an eternity in the lake of fire. Isn't it reasonable he can ask us to give our temporal life for him? He opened up the gateways for us to live eternally with him in paradise. Folks, doesn't that make it worthwhile then for him? Doesn't it just make it reasonable for him to say, whatever remaining portion of your life you have now that you've been saved, serve me, live for me. Follow by example. Make the same type of choices I make. See, we have to look at it that way, folks. We have to understand that following his example and thereby setting the example for others is truly, as Paul puts it here, our reasonable service. It only makes sense. It's only the logical thing to do. He gave himself for us. Why shouldn't we give ourselves for him?